Dave Wilson stood at the edge of his farm, looking out across the dry, cracked fields that had once thrived under his father's careful stewardship. The land was more than just earth and crops to him. It was a legacy, a part of his family's history that stretched back for generations. His father had built the farm from the ground up, working tirelessly to ensure it remained self-sustaining. Now, it was his turn to carry the burden, and the weight of it was growing heavier with each passing year. Inherited from his late father, the farm was a symbol of the hard work, resilience, and sacrifices that had defined the Wilson family. For Dave, it was his refuge from the world, a place where he could lose himself in the work and find solace amidst the rolling hills and wide-open spaces. But the world around him was changing. The small, quiet farming community that once thrived in the valley was becoming increasingly urbanized, with new developments popping up on every corner. Fields that had once been rich with crops were now giving way to sprawling suburban developments and strip malls. The land that had been farmed for centuries was becoming increasingly valuable, and as the real estate market boomed, so too did the pressure on farmers like Dave to sell. It wasn't just about making a living anymore. It was about survival in an economy that was quickly becoming hostile to those who worked the land. Dave had watched as many of his neighbors, struggling with rising costs and dwindling profits, had made the difficult decision to sell their farms, often to large corporations or developers who had no interest in preserving the land, only in profiting from it. Dave had never considered selling. To him, the farm was more than just a business venture. It was a part of who he was, who his father was, and who his grandfather had been. He couldn't imagine walking away from it. But as time went on, it became clear that his ability to hold on to the land was under threat from forces far beyond his control. The pressures were mounting, and it wasn't just the economy that was threatening his way of life. The catalyst for Dave's current predicament came in the form of his neighbor, Karen Matthews. Karen was a large woman, her personality as imposing as her physical stature. She had always been a bit of a bully in the neighborhood, using her position as one of the more established property owners to exert influence over others. Her tactics were subtle at first, asking to borrow things, making casual remarks about land ownership and property values, but soon it became clear that Karen had much bigger plans in mind. She wasn't just interested in getting a few favors, she was after something far more significant. And it was her greed and thirst for control that was about to plunge Dave into a battle he had never anticipated. It all started with a letter. One morning, as Dave sat down at his kitchen table, sipping his coffee and skimming through the usual pile of bills and advertisements, he found something different. It was an official-looking letter from a law firm addressed to him, with a formal tone and an air of importance. At first, Dave thought it was some sort of mistake, perhaps an issue with the water rights or a tax problem. He had been dealing with various administrative challenges for years, and this was just another one of those routine issues that farmers had to face. But when he opened the letter and began reading, his stomach sank. The letter was from Karen's lawyer, and it stated that she was claiming legal ownership of the water source that ran through his property. The water that had sustained his farm for decades, water that was essential for irrigation, livestock, and everything else that kept his farm running, was now, according to Karen, her property. She demanded that Dave pay a significant fee to continue accessing the water or face legal action. The letter was clear. If Dave refused, she would cut off his water supply, and without water, there was no way his farm could survive. Dave was stunned. He had always thought of the water rights as something inherent to the land. He had never once questioned his right to access the river that ran through his farm, nor had he ever imagined that his neighbor would try to seize control of something so essential. But Karen was no fool. She had done her research, and she knew that the ownership of water rights in their region was a complicated and often murky issue. Over the years, Dave had been so focused on the farm itself that he hadn't kept up with the legal intricacies surrounding the land. And now, Karen had found a way to exploit that. He tried to reason with her at first. He went over to her house, a large, sprawling property on the other side of the creek, and knocked on her door. When she answered, she greeted him with a false smile, her eyes gleaming with a satisfaction that immediately set Dave on edge. She invited him in for tea, but he refused. He had no interest in pleasantries. He wanted to resolve this matter before it escalated further. "I don't understand, Karen," Dave began, trying to keep his voice calm. "The water has always been shared between our properties. It's part of the land, part of what we've always used to run our farms. You can't just take it from me." Karen's smile never faltered. "Oh, Dave, I'm not taking anything from you," she said sweetly. "I'm merely ensuring that the water is being used properly. You've been using more than your fair share for years, and it's time for you to start paying for it." Dave shook his head in disbelief. "This is insane. You're telling me that all these years I've been stealing water from you?" "Not stealing," Karen replied, her voice cool and patronizing. "Just mismanaging. You've been using more than your fair share, and I've had enough. I'm not going to let you run your farm at my expense any longer." The conversation ended there, but it was clear to Dave that Karen wasn't going to back down. She had already made up her mind, and now he was faced with a choice: give in to her demands and watch his farm slip further into financial ruin, or fight back. But what could he do? He wasn't a lawyer, and he didn't have the resources to go toe-to-toe with a wealthy, well-connected adversary like Karen. And yet, as he stood there, staring at her smug face, something inside him clicked. He wasn't going to give up without a fight. Not this time. And that was how it all began. What had started as a simple dispute over water access was about to spiral into something much bigger, something that would test Dave's resolve, his ingenuity, and his very sense of identity. As the days passed, the pressure mounted. His farm was in jeopardy, and he knew that if he didn't act fast, he would lose everything. But what could he do? How could he possibly win against someone as powerful as Karen? In the weeks that followed, Dave began to dig deeper into the issue. He consulted with experts, hired a lawyer, and started to uncover the truth behind Karen's claim. What he found shocked him. Karen was not only after the water rights, but she was also part of a larger network of investors and business interests that had been slowly buying up land in the area, driving out the local farmers and replacing them with industrial operations. And that was when it hit him. He wasn't just fighting for his water, he was fighting for the future of his farm, and the future of all the small independent farmers in the region. He couldn't let Karen win. He couldn't let her take the one thing that mattered most to him. It was time to take a stand. But how? Dave didn't have the answers yet, but he knew that he had to act fast before it was too late. What began as a battle over water would soon turn into a full-scale war for control of the land, and he was going to fight every step of the way. The next few days after Dave's initial confrontation with Karen were a blur of frustration and confusion. He couldn't shake the image of Karen's smug face as she had delivered her demands with such certainty, as though she had already won. It gnawed at him, making him wonder how she could be so sure of her position. His mind raced with questions. Had he missed something? Had she been planning this for months? Dave knew the legalities surrounding water rights were complex, but he had always assumed that something as basic as water access would be more straightforward. He'd been operating under the belief that the water running through his land was his right, a resource that had been there long before Karen had come to live next door. How could she now claim ownership of it? He spent the following days poring over the deeds to his land and the historical records of the area. As a farmer, Dave wasn't a stranger to paperwork, but he had never needed to delve into legal documents so deeply. The more he looked, the more uneasy he became. He had inherited this farm from his father and his father from his own. The land had been in the family for generations, and there had never been any question of who owned what. But now, as Dave traced the history of the land back through the public records, he began to see cracks in his understanding of how everything had been arranged. The deeds weren't as simple as he had thought. The boundaries were unclear in some areas, and there were references to land being shared or held in common, vague terms that only seemed to add to the confusion. To get a clearer picture, Dave contacted a local attorney, someone who had helped him with minor farm-related legal issues in the past. But as he explained his situation, the attorney's demeanor changed from casual to concerned. The lawyer informed Dave that the issue of water rights wasn't as straightforward as he had imagined, especially in a region like theirs, where water was increasingly seen as a commodity. There were multiple claims to the same water sources in the area, many of which had been contested and litigated over the years. The lawyer mentioned a specific law that allowed landowners to divert water for personal use, but only within certain limits, and the law had evolved over time to accommodate the growing need for water for industrial purposes. Dave didn't know what to make of it. He had never thought of water as something that could be owned or sold, at least not in the way Karen seemed to view it. The more Dave researched, the more he realized that Karen wasn't just a neighbor trying to get more out of him for a water supply. She had a deep, almost obsessive interest in controlling the water rights in the region. It wasn't just about extracting money from him, it was about gaining power. Dave learned that Karen had been quietly buying up land around her property for years, expanding her holdings under the radar. She had built relationships with local developers and investors who shared her goal of transforming the area into a more lucrative commercial zone. The more Dave uncovered, the more he began to see a pattern. Karen wasn't just a farmer. She was playing a much bigger game, and Dave was now caught in the middle of it. But what really shocked him came when he found out about the water rights agreement that had been made long before he had even been born. It seemed that the water running through his land had originally been part of a larger agreement between multiple landowners in the region, a deal brokered decades ago, long before Karen had even moved to the area. The agreement had allowed farmers and ranchers to share the water, with each person's usage governed by strict limits. However, the agreement had been vague in some areas, particularly when it came to land boundaries and water usage rights, and that vagueness had allowed Karen to exploit a loophole to her advantage. She had somehow managed to get her hands on documentation that suggested she had inherited certain rights to the water source, rights that, in Dave's mind, were dubious at best. With each new revelation, Dave's sense of disbelief grew. He had always known Karen was ambitious, but he had never suspected she was capable of orchestrating such an intricate scheme. She had manipulated the system to such an extent that she could now claim a resource that had always been common property, and that resource was now being used as a weapon against him. In the meantime, Karen's tactics grew more aggressive. She began to send him letters, each more threatening than the last. The demands escalated quickly. First, she asked for an outrageous sum to continue providing access to the water. Then, she began making veiled threats, warning Dave that if he didn't comply, she would have no choice but to take legal action. Every time Dave tried to reach out to her for clarification, she ignored his calls or gave him vague responses. It was as if she was daring him to challenge her, confident that she could win. But Dave wasn't ready to give up just yet. He knew he had to fight, but he didn't know how. He didn't have the resources to take on someone like Karen, who had money and influence on her side. The more he thought about it, the more desperate the situation seemed. If he couldn't come up with a plan quickly, he risked losing everything he had worked for: his farm, his livelihood, his family's legacy. That's when Dave made a decision that would change everything. He would fight Karen, but he wouldn't do it alone. He began to reach out to others in the community, quietly at first, to see if anyone else had been affected by Karen's schemes. He wasn't the only one. A few other farmers and ranchers in the area had also been contacted by Karen, though they hadn't taken the threat as seriously as Dave. Most of them were too intimidated by her influence to do anything about it. But Dave wasn't going to be intimidated. He knew he had to stand up to her, not just for himself, but for everyone who had been pushed around by her over the years. As Dave made his plans, he realized that he wasn't just dealing with a greedy neighbor who wanted more water. He was dealing with a woman who was using manipulation, legal loopholes, and underhanded tactics to gain control of a vital resource in the region. Water, something that everyone depended on. He realized that Karen's thirst for power had no limits. If she was allowed to continue unchecked, it could spell the end of independent farming in the area. Dave's next steps were critical. He began to gather evidence of Karen's illegal actions, compiling documents and records that showed how she had exploited legal loopholes to gain control over water rights. But he knew that simply gathering evidence wouldn't be enough. He needed to do something bold, something that would shift the balance of power. That's when the idea hit him. If Karen could control the water, why couldn't he? Why shouldn't he take control of the one thing that was the lifeblood of the region? Dave decided to buy the local water supply company. It was a risky move, one that would put him deep into debt, but it was the only way he could ensure that Karen wouldn't be able to control the water any longer. If he owned the water supply, he would control access to it, and that would give him the leverage he needed to push back against Karen's threats. It was a bold, desperate move, but it was the only one that made sense. As Dave contacted the water supply company, he realized just how much he had underestimated Karen. She wasn't just a neighbor looking to make a quick profit, she was part of something much bigger. But that didn't matter anymore. Dave wasn't going to let her win. He was ready to fight back, but this time, he wasn't going to be playing defense. He was going on the offense. It was time to take control, and he wasn't going to let anything stop him. The days following Dave's decision to fight back against Karen were filled with a combination of dread and determination. Every morning, as he stood on the worn wooden porch of his farmhouse, staring out across the sprawling fields that had once felt like his sanctuary, he couldn't shake the gnawing feeling that everything was at stake. What had begun as a dispute over water rights had grown into something much larger, something that he had never anticipated. Dave knew that if he wasn't careful, he could lose everything: his farm, his family's legacy, and the life he had worked so hard to build. But now, there was no turning back. He had made his decision, and it was time to act. In the days that followed, Dave became increasingly reclusive, poring over every document he could find related to water rights, property ownership, and the legal frameworks that governed his land. He had hired a lawyer, someone with more experience in water rights than the local attorney he had consulted before. But even with their help, it became apparent that Karen had created a labyrinth of legal complexity that was difficult to navigate. The more Dave dug, the more he realized how far-reaching Karen's influence was. It wasn't just her land and her water that she controlled. She had woven herself into the fabric of the local economy, gaining favor with key figures in the county, local businesses, and even some politicians. Every step forward seemed to be met with a dozen obstacles. But Dave was resolute. He had no choice but to push forward, to face whatever came his way, no matter how difficult or dangerous it seemed. The first escalation came when Dave received a phone call from his lawyer, telling him that Karen had filed a legal complaint against him, claiming that he had violated her rights to the water supply by continuing to use it without her permission. The lawyer explained that Karen was invoking an obscure clause in a century-old agreement between landowners that would allow her to block access to the water unless Dave paid an exorbitant fee. The legal language was dense and confusing, but the gist of it was clear. Karen was using her resources to pressure Dave into a corner, making it almost impossible for him to defend himself without engaging in a drawn-out, costly legal battle. Dave knew that this was just the beginning. Karen wasn't going to stop with just the legal threats. He had already seen how she operated, how she used fear and intimidation to get what she wanted, and now it seemed that her tactics were escalating. She was pulling every string she could, using her wealth, her political connections, and her knowledge of the law to undermine him. Dave couldn't afford to let her win. He knew that if he allowed her to take control of the water, she would only expand her grip, eventually taking everything he had worked for. He had to find a way to strike back. But how? How could he fight someone with so much power? The answer came unexpectedly. Dave had always been a practical man, someone who relied on hard work and perseverance to get by. But now, he needed to think more strategically. He needed to turn the tables on Karen. If she could control the water, why couldn't he? Why couldn't he take control of the very thing that had the power to cripple her? He had always known about the local water supply company, a small operation that had managed the water distribution in the area for decades, but he had never thought much of it. It was just another piece of the puzzle, another business that seemed to operate in the background of his life. But now, it seemed like the key to everything. If he could buy the water supply company, he could control the water that Karen was trying to take from him. It was a bold move, one that would stretch his finances to the breaking point, but it was the only option left. Dave reached out to the water supply company, carefully making inquiries about purchasing the operation. To his surprise, the owner of the company, a man named Thomas, was more than willing to entertain the idea. Thomas explained that the company had been struggling financially for years, and the offer of a buyout could help keep the business afloat. Dave knew it wouldn't be easy. The purchase would take all of his savings and then some, and he would have to take out loans, securing his farm as collateral, but he didn't see any other way. This was his chance to gain the upper hand, to cut off Karen's access to the one thing she was using to control him. As Dave moved forward with the purchase, he realized that Karen wasn't going to take this lying down. She had always been calculating, and now she was beginning to react. The first sign came when Dave received a letter from her attorney, a formal cease and desist order demanding that he stop pursuing the buyout. The letter was filled with legal jargon, threatening him with lawsuits and penalties if he didn't back down. It was clear that Karen had anticipated this move, but it didn't matter. Dave wasn't backing down. He had made his decision, and there was no turning back. But even as he pressed forward with the buyout, Karen's tactics grew more aggressive. She started showing up at the farm unannounced, standing on the edge of the property, watching him from a distance. Dave noticed her more frequently, lurking in her truck by the fence line, peering out from behind the trees. It felt like she was always watching, waiting for him to make a mistake. Her presence was unnerving, and it only fueled Dave's resolve to finish what he had started. But as the days wore on, the pressure began to take its toll. The financial strain of the buyout weighed heavily on him, and the constant threat of legal action loomed over his every decision. He couldn't afford to make a misstep. The next escalation came when the water supply company's ownership changed hands, and Dave officially took control. The first thing he did was secure the water sources, ensuring that Karen's claim to the supply was null and void. He set up barriers, installed monitoring systems, and made sure that no one could access the water without his permission. But just as he was beginning to feel a sense of victory, Karen struck again. This time she turned to the local government, using her political connections to call in favors and make life difficult for Dave. She filed complaints with the county about alleged violations on his property, accusing him of illegal water usage, environmental damage, and a host of other fabricated issues. It was clear that Karen was trying to drag him through a bureaucratic nightmare, hoping to wear him down with endless red tape. As Dave dealt with the mounting pressure from the government, he knew he couldn't let Karen's tactics succeed. He had come too far to back down now. He began to fight fire with fire, using his newfound control of the water supply to his advantage. He called in favors from local farmers, building alliances with those who had been harmed by Karen's actions. Slowly, he began to gather support, convincing others that they too had been under her thumb for far too long. The more people he rallied to his cause, the more Karen's influence began to crumble. But the battle was far from over. Karen wasn't going to give up easily. She began to threaten those who stood with Dave, using intimidation and fear to try to drive them away. She even went so far as to sabotage Dave's equipment, damaging the irrigation systems on his farm. It was a direct attack, and it pushed Dave to his breaking point. He realized that he was no longer fighting just for water or for his farm. He was fighting for his survival. The stakes had never been higher, and Dave knew that if he didn't make his move soon, he would lose everything. As the pressure mounted, he began to prepare for the final showdown, gathering his resources, building his alliances, and readying himself for whatever Karen would throw at him next. He had taken control of the water supply, but Karen had made it clear that she wouldn't stop until she had everything in her grasp. Dave had learned one thing in this battle. There would be no easy way out. As the conflict escalated, Dave's resolve only grew stronger. He was prepared for the fight of his life, and he wasn't about to let Karen or anyone else take what was rightfully his. As the weeks wore on, Dave's situation began to feel increasingly dire. The initial satisfaction of securing the water supply company and taking control of the resource that Karen had sought to monopolize quickly gave way to the harsh reality of the battle he had unleashed. What had started as a simple dispute over water had spiraled into something far more complex, with far-reaching consequences that Dave had not anticipated. Each new challenge seemed to compound the last, and it became clear that Karen wasn't just a woman with a vendetta. She was a force to be reckoned with, a ruthless adversary who would stop at nothing to get what she wanted. It wasn't just about water anymore. It was about power, control, and dominance over the land and its resources. Dave had secured the water rights, but Karen was not content to let the matter end there. She had made her intentions clear. She wasn't going to back down, and she wasn't going to let Dave take the lead without a fight. Her next move was to leverage her connections with local businesses and government officials to undermine his position. Through her influence, Karen was able to pressure several key figures into siding with her, painting Dave as an obstructionist who was hindering local progress. She started a campaign to convince the public that Dave was not only a threat to her, but to the entire community. He was portrayed as a selfish farmer who was hoarding water and preventing growth and development in the region. Karen had a gift for manipulation, and her ability to sway public opinion made her a dangerous opponent. Dave had always been a man of action, someone who preferred to solve problems directly. But this was different. The game Karen was playing wasn't just about logic or fairness. It was about perception, and perception could be just as powerful as the truth. The weight of the public relations war began to weigh heavily on Dave, especially as more and more people started to question his motives. He had fought so hard to secure the water rights, but now it seemed as though he was losing the battle for public support. The community that had once supported him now seemed to be divided, with many of his neighbors beginning to side with Karen, unsure of who to trust. Despite the pressure, Dave refused to back down. He knew that giving up would mean losing everything he had worked for: the farm, the land, and his family's legacy. But as the legal and public battles intensified, it became clear that simply holding the line was no longer enough. He needed to take the fight to Karen, and he needed to do it in a way that would not only protect his farm but also expose the depths of her manipulations. The turning point came when Dave received a call from an old friend, Tom, who had worked with him on the farm for years. Tom had retired from the business several years earlier, but he kept in touch with Dave regularly, offering advice and support when needed. Dave had always respected Tom's judgment, and it was Tom who had helped him navigate some of the more difficult decisions in his life. This time, however, it wasn't just about farming or business. Tom had stumbled upon something that would change the course of the entire conflict. Tom had been investigating Karen's business dealings, and what he uncovered was nothing short of shocking. Through his connections, Tom was able to confirm that Karen was not just a landowner with an agenda. She was part of a much larger operation, a network of developers and investors who were systematically buying up land in the area, using aggressive tactics to push out independent farmers and ranchers. Karen had been at the center of this scheme for years, slowly amassing power and influence over the region's water supply and using it to manipulate everyone around her. It turned out that her attempts to control the water weren't just about gaining leverage over Dave. She was using it as a stepping stone in a larger plan to seize control of the entire region. By monopolizing the water, she could control the development of the land itself, dictating who would be able to use it and how it would be used. The discovery was a game changer. It wasn't just about water rights anymore. It was about exposing the corruption that lay beneath the surface of Karen's actions. Dave now realized that he wasn't fighting just for his farm. He was fighting for the future of the entire community. If Karen's plans were allowed to succeed, it would mean the end of independent farming in the area and the start of a new era where power and wealth were consolidated in the hands of a few, with the rest of the community left to pick up the scraps. Armed with this new information, Dave knew he had to act quickly, but he also knew that this would be no easy fight. Karen had built her empire through careful, calculated moves, and taking her down would require more than just legal maneuvering. It would require a coordinated effort from the community, a united front that could expose her schemes and stop her, before she could expand her control any further. Dave wasn't alone in this fight, and he realized that he needed to rally the people around him, to show them the truth about Karen's manipulations. He wasn't just fighting for his farm anymore. He was fighting for the future of the entire region, for the future of the land that had been passed down for generations. In the days that followed, Dave began to work with his neighbors and allies to gather evidence of Karen's corruption. He knew that exposing her wouldn't be easy, but he had a new sense of purpose. He wasn't just protecting his family's legacy, he was protecting the integrity of the land itself. Dave and his team gathered documents, interviewed former employees, and compiled records of Karen's business dealings. It wasn't just about showing that Karen was trying to take control of the water. It was about proving that she had been using underhanded tactics for years to manipulate the system and enrich herself at the expense of everyone else. The deeper Dave dug, the more he realized how deeply entrenched Karen's influence was. She had covered her tracks well, using legal loopholes and political connections to hide her true intentions. But Dave was determined to find a way through, to show the world the truth. But even as Dave made progress in uncovering the extent of Karen's corruption, he faced mounting pressure from every direction. Karen's legal team launched a series of counterattacks, filing more lawsuits and claims against Dave and his allies. She used her influence to intimidate witnesses, and she spread lies about Dave to discredit him and turn the community against him. Her tactics were underhanded, but they were effective. The more she pushed, the more people began to question Dave's intentions. It became clear that Karen was playing a long game, and that she wasn't going to stop until she had everything she wanted. In the face of all this, Dave knew that the stakes were higher than ever. He had already put everything on the line, and now it was time to make his move. But he also knew that this was just the beginning. Karen was more dangerous than he had realized, and taking her down would require more than just uncovering the truth. It would require a concerted effort, a coordinated campaign to expose her corruption and bring her to justice. The fight was far from over, and Dave had no intention of backing down. As the conflict reached its boiling point, Dave found himself standing at a crossroads. He could no longer simply play defense. The time had come to go on the offense, to take the fight to Karen in a way that would expose her for the fraud she was. But he couldn't do it alone. He needed to build an even stronger alliance, one that would unite the community and bring the truth to light. The struggle for control of the land had become a struggle for the very future of the region, and Dave was ready to see it through to the end. As the pressure from Karen continued to build, Dave found himself facing a series of obstacles that he had never anticipated. The initial relief that came with securing the water rights and gaining control over the local water supply company began to fade as Karen escalated her efforts to undermine him. Her legal team had already launched multiple lawsuits against Dave, claiming violations of various environmental regulations and accusing him of illegal water diversion. At first, these legal battles seemed like nothing more than a nuisance, but it quickly became apparent that Karen was using them as a weapon to tie Dave up in legal proceedings, draining his resources and distracting him from the real fight. But Karen's tactics were not limited to the courtroom. She had started to mobilize her allies in the local government, calling in favors from influential figures who had long been under her influence. Through her connections, she managed to have a series of inspections conducted on Dave's farm, all of them aimed at finding any excuse to shut him down. The inspections were rigorous, and despite Dave's best efforts to keep everything in order, it felt like they were just waiting for him to slip up. The more they scrutinized his property, the more it felt like he was living under a microscope, each move he made being watched and judged. To make matters worse, Karen's efforts to sway public opinion were starting to take hold. She had launched a full-scale media campaign, casting Dave as a villain in the eyes of the local community. She painted him as a man who was hoarding resources, putting the needs of his farm above the welfare of the entire region. Her messages were subtle but effective, playing on the fears of the community about droughts and water shortages. She positioned herself as the responsible landowner, the one who understood the need for sustainable development and wise water usage, while Dave was portrayed as the reckless farmer who would destroy everything in his path if left unchecked. It wasn't just the legal battles he was fighting anymore. It was the battle for public perception, and with Karen's influence spreading, he realized just how much ground he had lost. Dave knew that he couldn't win this fight by simply responding to Karen's attacks. He had already been pushed into a defensive position, and he needed to change the dynamics of the battle if he was going to have any chance of success. It became clear to him that the only way to break Karen's hold on the community was to expose her for who she truly was. But in order to do that, he would need more than just the documents and evidence he had gathered. He needed to hit her where it hurt the most: her reputation, her power, and her influence over the community. In the weeks that followed, Dave began to work tirelessly, gathering more evidence of Karen's illegal dealings and manipulative behavior. He knew that if he was going to expose her, he needed to have a strategy that went beyond simply fighting her in court. He started to dig deeper into her financial records, looking for connections between her real estate holdings, the water supply company, and the local government officials she had been working with. As he pieced together the puzzle, Dave realized that Karen's grip on the region was far more extensive than he had originally thought. She wasn't just after the water rights. She was orchestrating a larger scheme to control the entire area, using her influence to buy up land and force out the small farmers who had once thrived in the region. It was a dangerous realization. Dave had already been under attack from Karen's legal team, but now it was clear that he was up against something far more sinister. Karen wasn't just a ruthless businesswoman. She was part of a corrupt network that had been using manipulation, intimidation, and underhanded tactics to reshape the entire region to her liking. And with each new piece of evidence he uncovered, it became more apparent that Karen had been using Dave as a pawn in her game from the very beginning. In response to the mounting pressure, Dave knew he had to take action, and he had to do it quickly. The battle had reached a critical point, and it was no longer about just surviving. It was about taking the fight to Karen. But he knew that he couldn't do it alone. He needed to build a coalition, to rally the people around him who had been affected by Karen's actions, and to create a united front that could push back against her. He began to reach out to other farmers and ranchers in the area, many of whom had been silent in the face of Karen's power. Slowly, he started to gain their trust, showing them the evidence he had gathered and explaining the real stakes of the battle they were all facing. It wasn't easy. Karen had spent years cultivating relationships and buying loyalty, and it was difficult to convince people that they were being manipulated. But as Dave began to expose the full extent of Karen's network, more and more people started to see the truth. They began to understand that Karen wasn't just a businesswoman with a strong sense of entitlement. She was part of a much larger, more dangerous system that was exploiting them for profit. As word spread, the coalition began to grow. Dave had built a small but formidable group of allies who were willing to fight back against Karen's schemes. Meanwhile, Karen was ramping up her efforts to discredit Dave and destroy his credibility. She began to spread rumors about his farm, claiming that he was breaking environmental regulations and polluting the land. She also started to use more aggressive tactics, sending threatening letters to his allies and trying to intimidate them into backing off. But Dave's coalition was holding strong. The more Karen pushed, the more determined they became. It was no longer just about water. It was about taking a stand against the system that had been allowing corruption and exploitation to thrive unchecked. The second escalation reached its peak when Karen, in an act of desperation, hired a private investigator to dig into Dave's past, hoping to find something, anything, that she could use to discredit him. She had clearly underestimated Dave's resolve and his ability to outmaneuver her. Instead of finding weaknesses, the investigator uncovered more of Karen's own dirty dealings, including financial ties to corrupt developers and shady real estate transactions that linked her directly to the local government. This information was a gold mine, and Dave knew that it could be the key to bringing her down once and for all. But the stakes were higher than ever. As the conflict intensified, Dave knew that he was no longer just fighting for his land and his farm. He was fighting for the future of the entire community. If Karen was allowed to continue unchecked, she would reshape the region in her image, pushing out small farmers and consolidating power in the hands of a few wealthy elites. The battle was far from over, and Dave knew that the only way to stop her was to expose the full extent of her corruption. As he prepared for the next phase of his fight, Dave understood that the odds were stacked against him. Karen had money, power, and influence, and she wasn't afraid to use them to get what she wanted. But Dave had something she didn't: an unwavering sense of justice and the support of a growing coalition of people who were willing to stand up to her. The second escalation had proven to him that this was a fight worth having, and he wasn't about to back down now. With new evidence in hand and the support of his allies, Dave prepared to take the fight to the next level. The war for control of the land and its resources was far from over, but Dave was ready to make his move. He had already sacrificed so much, and now he was determined to see it through to the end. The stakes had never been higher, and the battle was about to reach its most intense phase yet. The tension between Dave and Karen had been building for months, each step in their battle bringing them closer to an inevitable confrontation. The stakes had grown exponentially. What began as a dispute over water rights had become a fight for the very future of the land, for the community, and for everything that Dave had worked to protect. Karen, with her political influence, her wealth, and her connections, had seemed unstoppable. But Dave was no longer the same man who had reluctantly accepted her initial threats. He had learned the game she was playing, and he had started to turn the tables. The alliance he had forged with other farmers and members of the community had solidified into a formidable force. Together, they had gathered the evidence of Karen's manipulations, her corruption, and her role in a scheme that spanned far beyond the local water supply. Karen had underestimated Dave's ability to fight back. She had underestimated his resolve, his intelligence, and his sense of justice. Now, it was time for the final showdown. The tipping point came when Dave, armed with the information he had painstakingly gathered, realized that the fight could no longer be fought just through legal means. The courts, as much as they were important, had already been rigged by Karen's influence. They were a battleground where money and power often drowned out the truth, and Dave had learned that fighting her in the legal system alone would never be enough. What he needed was to make the truth public, something that would shine a light on Karen's corrupt practices and turn the tide of public opinion against her. He had to expose her for what she truly was: a manipulative, greedy opportunist who cared nothing for the land, the people, or the future, only for her own personal gain. The idea for the final move came from an unexpected source. It was during a quiet meeting with his most trusted ally, Tom, that the plan began to take shape. Tom had been working behind the scenes, gathering information about Karen's financial dealings, trying to piece together the puzzle that linked her to a series of shady real estate transactions and illegal land grabs. It wasn't just water she was after. It was the land, and the resources that came with it. Tom had uncovered a crucial piece of information. Karen had been laundering money through a series of offshore accounts linked to a network of developers and investors who were working with her to drive out local farmers and take control of the land. She had used her influence to manipulate zoning laws, forcing families to sell their properties at a fraction of their true value. She had built an empire on the backs of hardworking people who had no idea they were being exploited. Tom's discovery was the key that Dave needed to take Karen down. With this new evidence, Dave knew that he could expose her to the public in a way that would be impossible for her to deny or spin. But he couldn't do it alone. He needed to make sure the truth reached the right people, those who would be able to amplify it and turn the tide of the battle in his favor. He reached out to a local investigative journalist, someone who had a reputation for taking down corrupt officials and businessmen. Dave knew that getting the story into the media would be his best chance at defeating Karen. But he also knew that this wasn't just about exposing her corruption. It was about igniting a movement, a rallying cry for the community to stand up and fight back. The night before the big reveal, Dave sat alone in his office, staring at the papers in front of him. His fingers brushed over the evidence: bank statements, documents, contracts that revealed Karen's illegal dealings. This was it. He had the proof he needed to end her reign of terror. But even as he prepared for what was to come, a sense of unease settled over him. He knew that once he went public with this, there would be no going back. Karen wouldn't take this lightly. She had already shown that she was capable of anything to get what she wanted. And now that he was about to expose her for the fraud she was, he could only imagine what she might do in retaliation. But as he looked out over the land, Dave felt a renewed sense of purpose. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about all the people who had been manipulated, bullied, and pushed aside by Karen and her network. It was about the future of the community, the land, and the generations that would come after them. He wasn't just fighting for his farm. He was fighting for something bigger, a fairer, more just way of life where power wasn't concentrated in the hands of the few, but where ordinary people had a voice. And that voice, he realized, was his. The next morning, Dave met with the journalist who had already prepared a detailed report on Karen's financial dealings, backed by the documents Dave had provided. The article would be released that afternoon, along with a series of leaked documents that would expose Karen's role in the land grabs and her ties to corrupt officials. It wasn't just a story. It was an indictment of everything she had built. Dave knew that once it was out in the open, Karen's carefully constructed empire would start to unravel. She would have no choice but to confront the truth, and the public outcry would be impossible to ignore. As the journalist made final preparations, Dave received an unexpected call. It was from his lawyer, who had been handling the legal battles against Karen's lawsuits. The lawyer informed Dave that Karen had filed one last, desperate motion to take the case to the highest court in the state, hoping to overturn the ruling in Dave's favor and regain control of the water supply. The lawyer warned that Karen was using every legal avenue available to drag the fight out, hoping to exhaust Dave's resources and wear him down. But Dave wasn't afraid. He had already prepared for this. The media's story would hit at the same time as the court proceedings, and once the truth was out, Karen's influence would be shattered. The moment arrived. The article went live, and with it came the flood of public attention. People from all over the region began to read about Karen's corruption, her illegal land deals, and her manipulation of the local government. The backlash was immediate. Calls flooded into the local media outlets, with citizens demanding answers, questioning how a woman like Karen could be allowed to operate unchecked for so long. Protests erupted outside Karen's offices, and her supporters began to turn on her as the truth came to light. It was clear that Karen had underestimated the power of transparency. The public outcry was deafening, and her once solid foundation of influence began to crumble. But even as Karen's empire started to fall apart, she didn't go down quietly. In a last-ditch effort to salvage her reputation, she appeared on television, attempting to justify her actions and deny the allegations. But the damage had already been done. Her lies were exposed for all to see, and her carefully crafted image as a responsible businesswoman was shattered beyond repair. People who had once supported her turned their backs, and those who had been too afraid to speak out before began to come forward, sharing their own experiences of how Karen had used intimidation and manipulation to get what she wanted. The court battle continued, but with the public now firmly on his side, Dave found himself in a position of strength. Karen's attempts to regain control of the water supply were thwarted, and her legal team found themselves unable to counter the overwhelming evidence that had been presented in the media. The final ruling came quickly. The court sided with Dave, declaring that Karen's actions had been illegal and that she would no longer have any claim to the water rights or the land. It was a victory not just for Dave, but for the entire community. The corrupt system that Karen had built had been exposed, and in its place, a new chapter was beginning, one where the people had reclaimed their power. As Dave stood in the courtroom, the weight of the battle finally lifted off his shoulders. He had won, not just for himself, but for the land, for the community, and for everyone who had been affected by Karen's greed. The victory wasn't just legal, it was a moral one. It was a victory for justice, for fairness, and for the belief that even in the face of seemingly insurmountable odds, the truth would always come to light. In the aftermath of the court ruling, the dust began to settle, and with it, the weight of the long battle lifted from Dave's shoulders. As he stood on the porch of his farmhouse, looking out over the land that had been at the center of the storm, a deep sense of relief washed over him. It wasn't just that he had won, or that Karen had been exposed for the manipulative force she truly was. It was the realization that everything he had fought for, his farm, his family's legacy, the future of the land, had been preserved. Karen's empire had crumbled, and with it, the threat that had loomed over the region for so long had finally been eradicated. The community, which had been deeply divided throughout the conflict, slowly began to come together. It wasn't an immediate process, and there was still lingering mistrust from some who had been swept up in Karen's campaign of manipulation. But Dave could see the change. People were starting to talk again, to work together, to rebuild what had been broken. The victory was not just legal or financial. It was a victory for the community itself, one that showed what could be accomplished when people stood together against corruption and greed. Karen had used fear, intimidation, and deceit to carve out her own empire, but it was the collective power of the people who had stood up to her that ultimately prevailed. As for Karen, her fall from grace was swift and brutal. The public backlash against her had been unprecedented. Despite her best efforts to salvage her reputation through carefully crafted apologies and media appearances, the damage was done. The people who had once supported her began to turn away in droves. Her businesses faltered, her political connections disintegrated, and the legal battles piled up. In the end, she found herself facing a mountain of debt, lawsuits, and a tarnished reputation that no amount of money or influence could fix. The empire she had so carefully built had collapsed, and she was left with nothing but the wreckage of her former ambitions. Dave had always known that the true battle wasn't just about water rights. It was about something much deeper. It was about control, about the future of the land, and about the idea that no one should have the power to manipulate the system for their own gain at the expense of others. He had never set out to be a hero or to take down someone like Karen, but he had been forced into a position where he had no choice but to fight for what was right. What had started as a simple struggle for survival had become a fight for justice, and in the end, it was justice that had won. The farm, once on the brink of being lost to the whims of a greedy neighbor, had been preserved. Dave had managed to keep his land, his livelihood, and his family's legacy intact, but the struggle had also given him something more, an understanding of the power of community, of the importance of standing up for what is right, and of the strength that comes from knowing that one person, no matter how small or powerless they may seem, can make a difference. With Karen out of the picture, Dave took a step back and assessed what needed to be done to restore his farm to its full potential. The battle had taken its toll, both financially and emotionally. He had spent months fighting a war that had drained his resources, his energy, and his sense of peace. But now, with the legal battles behind him and the threat of Karen's control over the water supply gone, Dave began to focus on the future. There was much work to be done. Fields that needed attention, irrigation systems to be repaired, and the delicate balance of running a farm to be restored. But for the first time in a long while, Dave felt a sense of hope. The farm was his, and the future was something he could look forward to. The community, too, began to rebuild. Dave had been an important part of that process, but he knew that it would take time for the wounds caused by the conflict to heal completely. Many of his neighbors had been caught in the middle, torn between the pressure to side with Karen and the knowledge that they were being manipulated. But now, with the truth out in the open, there was a renewed sense of unity. People began to realize that they had been played by Karen, and as more and more individuals came forward to share their experiences, the community's bonds grew stronger. They were no longer just neighbors. They were allies, and together they had defeated a common enemy. Dave's reputation, too, was changing. He had been painted by Karen as a selfish, reckless farmer, someone who was standing in the way of progress and growth. But now, as the dust settled, people began to see him for who he truly was. A man who had fought for what was right, who had stood up to a powerful adversary in order to protect his land, his family, and his community. He wasn't just a farmer. He was a leader. Someone who had proven that, even in the face of overwhelming odds, it was possible to take a stand and make a difference. As the weeks turned into months, Dave found himself reconnecting with his neighbors, rebuilding the relationships that had been strained during the battle. Some had already moved on, choosing to sell their land and pursue other ventures, but others, the ones who had stayed true to the cause, began to see the potential for a new era. They were no longer afraid. They no longer feared the power that Karen had once held over them. And together, they began to look for ways to ensure that no one would ever again be able to take advantage of the land or its resources. The community was rebuilding, but it wasn't just about the farm. It was about the people, the land, and the future they would create together. Dave knew that the battle had changed him. It had forced him to confront his own fears and doubts, to question what he was willing to stand up for and what he was willing to lose. But it had also shown him the power of resilience, of standing firm in the face of adversity, and of the strength that comes from knowing that no matter how big or powerful the enemy may be, you can always fight back. The road ahead was still uncertain, but Dave knew that with the support of his community and the lessons he had learned, he would face whatever came next with the same determination that had gotten him this far. The land, the water, and the future. These were things worth fighting for. As the sun set over the fields, Dave stood on his porch once again, a sense of peace settling over him. The fight was over, but the journey was just beginning, and for the first time in a long while Dave felt ready for whatever the future held.